Very busy boy last year.
This is a week. I can't. If you can't remember 3.5 million pounds, one wonders what will be in the memoirs. What's he remembered?
Now, though, it's time for this.
Meet the Cerberus of columnists, the Janus of journalism, and the ultimate political portmanteau of opinion.
It's alive! It's alive! It's alive!
Finkelstein with Daniel Finkelstein and David Aaronovitch on Times Radio.
Yeah, we might be talking about busking, but here's two people who never busk it. Everything they come out with has always been very carefully thought through. Morning, Danny Finkelstein in the studio. Morning, Danny.
Good morning.
And good morning to David Aaronovitch. Good morning, David.
Good morning. I once really wanted to strangle a busker in Dresden. And the reason was...
Is that the title of
a
your
really
memoirs?
plaintive, continuous rendition, because the hotel was not far from the big church in the centre there, of Hallelujah. And Hallelujah is an absolute buskers staple. If you can't sing anything else, you can sing that for all kinds of, it's not very difficult to sing. The registers don't change very much. And I'm not normally I'm sort of really kind of peaceable and placid about these things, as you can imagine. But I honestly, it was everything my wife could do to restrain me from going up to him and say, would you just do something else or go away? And then I thought, well, actually, this isn't my country and it isn't my right to do it. But
Have you had any run-ins with buskers, Danny?
No, I can't say that I have.
There we are. Good. We finally found the thing that Danny doesn't have an anecdote about. Right, let's turn our attention to politics then. And obviously, a lot's been raked over with Nadhim Zahawi, and we wait to see what happens. This investigation is running. The thing I'm quite interested in sort of trying to tease out, Danny, is the calculation of if, when, and how to sack someone. And sometimes, a prime minister will decide, well, this person is worth all the economic or the political damage and economic damage it might have turned out, given Nadhim Zahawi's tax bill. But the calculation of, well, if I sack someone, they might cause trouble on the back benches. If I keep them, it's causing me damage. I don't want to look like somebody who dithers, but also I don't want to look like I'm not giving people a fair hearing. What is the calculation that goes on?
So I think it's much more the latter, right? So one of the things that people don't notice when they're watching these scandals from the outside is that these people are all individuals who have a personal relationship with the Prime Minister. And the Prime Minister doesn't want to be unfair to them. I saw that happen quite a lot with David Cameron, where somebody would get into trouble. They weren't necessarily politically worth anything, right? And the Prime Minister began to suspect that maybe they had done what they were accused of doing. The person will always say, I've been in this situation myself, by the way, having this said to me, I didn't do it, I'm innocent. It's very difficult when you face somebody to know what to do about that. And personal relationships have got much, much more to do with it. So I think it's the idea, I don't want to be unfair to this person. I don't want to end their political career for nothing. And even though they can see, because they are experienced people, that the politics means, and I think in Nadhim Zahawi's case it certainly will mean, that they won't survive it. You don't want to be the person that sort of said, I'm not prepared to hear your case out, I won't refer it to an independent arbitrator. You're not entitled to the normal processes that would take place in a business. They then do, and we can't use one of those normal processes, which would be suspension while your case is being looked at. So we're just going to remove you, and that causes a resentment among that person and that person's friends. So I think an awful lot of this is to do with personal relationships.
The one thing that struck me, David, thinking about this was that we went through all this before Christmas with Gavin Williamson and the revelations about him and his abusive texts he'd sent people. We were told that it's very dangerous to sack Gavin Williamson. He's going to be, it's better to have him inside the tent than outside. I'm not sure of all the many problems that Rishi Sunak's had over the last couple of months. Gavin Williamson being on the back benches is one of them. Do these things are slightly overblown sometimes?
Well, to which people will say, yet. But before we do, I just want to pick up on that last point of Danny's, going right the way back to the second sacking of Peter Mandelson by Tony Blair, of being a very good example of what can happen when sacking becomes your kind of first go-to point. People might agree that the first sacking of Peter Mandelson was justified. That was the mortgage sacking. But the second sacking of Peter Mandelson was hugely resented by him and by his friends. I think indirectly led to Robert Harris writing an entire novel which vilified Tony Blair in it. The one I think is called The Ghost Writer or The Ghost. It's called Ghost, because Robert Harris was a friend of Peter Mandelson and really genuinely felt that he had been very, very badly dealt with, mostly by Alistair Campbell, who he blamed for having persuaded Blair that this was a problem that was not going to, that they just didn't need, so they were going to get rid of Peter Mandelson. So I think this illustrates Danny's point perfectly. I don't know whether Tony Blair then subsequently regretted that sacking, but after it was widely believed that the sacking was wrong.
It was, yeah.
This
is a story. This is something on which I've got an anecdote, unlike the busker. I was working for William Hague at that time, and I remember on the Tuesday night before Prime Minister's Questions, I'd begun to look at what Peter Mandelson was supposed to have said and what had done and what he'd said on various TV programmes. And I realised in Prime Minister's Questions, Tony Blair wouldn't have an answer if you asked him certain questions because it was unclear and William Hague could just push him on it. And I further realised that as a result of that, Tony Blair would try to get rid of Peter Mandelson before Prime Minister's Questions in order to prevent an embarrassing Prime Minister's Questions, which is exactly what happened. And then when William Hague got up to ask him questions, it turned out he had nothing to ask him anymore because Peter Mandelson had already been removed. But without any question, once that had all been bottomed out, that sacking was not fair. He would have been better off, Tony Blair, standing by Peter Mandelson at that point. And though I do not think this will be the case with Nadhim Zahawi, I must say, there is a feeling in politics, you have to have got rid of this person in the next 24 hours. In the next 3 days, Nadhim Zahawi is not going to do any damage to the Conservative body or the country in the next 3 days that can't be undone relatively easily. So it is it is better, in my view, that you take some time to have the process, even though I think all of us look at it and think it would be a surprising process that concluded this was acceptable. It certainly doesn't look acceptable to me, but I'm much less taken by this whole, it must happen immediately or it's completely indecisive, And by the way, most people won't remember the whole incident within a year or two as well. So we can also overblow its political significance. I do think in the end it's very important that we haven't, that cabinet ministers are ethical. I don't think it will be acceptable if Nadhim Zahawi has, for example, told the permanent secretary or the prime minister things that were not true and is then allowed to remain. We had that during the sort of thing during Boris Johnson's period in office. It's not acceptable, but I don't have a problem with taking 3 or 4 days to find that out.
One more thing I want to add about the Zahawi thing is it's very interesting to follow the correspondence between his lawyers and one of the people, tax experts, who was trying to chase it down in July. Because essentially what they said was, you're at risk of libeling him, so don't kind of raise this and we deny it all, etc. Now, all these letters were happening in July. If you cross-reference them with the timescale within which Boris Johnson was going and Nadhim Zahawi was in various cars going to Downing Street, saying, "What am I getting, Nige?" to Nigel Adams, etc., because he thought he was going to get a kind of preferment. They are more or less the same dates as it happens. And I think one of the most egregious elements of this is the way in which somebody was threatened with the possibility of libel action for essentially saying something that was true, and that was demonstrably true. And the second thing I'd say about this is, like a lot of people, I'm doing my taxes incredibly late this week. And I have agonised about whether or not a particular £1,500 payment fits into a tax year or not. Really gone into that. The idea that somebody mislays £3.7 million worth of tax is just, to most people in this country, is just staggering. Yeah. You just kind of...
I do wonder actually whether the fact it is happening right now when lots of people are doing their tax returns will add to... It doesn't matter, really, in the grand scheme of things, but in terms of the political impact and the awareness of it.
What I suspect will happen is that the ethics advisor will conclude that one of these various things, like the libel accusation or not telling the truth to the Prime Minister or not telling the truth to the Permanent Secretary, will have broken the ministerial code and will thus step round around the question of whether or not the tax itself did, and that's what I think will happen. But for most people, you're quite right, David. These kind of large sums, which were seemed to me to be clearly the subject of what George Osborne described as aggressive tax avoidance. That seems to me, as though what most people regard the issue is, but it probably won't be the issue which the independent ethics advisor homes in on.
Yeah.
The other thing, as well as writing the letters to become Chancellor and then tell Boris Johnson to go, and writing the legal letters, turns out he spent last summer writing his memoirs as well. So he was very busy boy last year.
This is a week. I can't. If you can't remember £3.5 million, one wonders what will be in the memoirs. What's he remembered?
Yeah, recollections may differ. To quote the late
Joke of the day.
Right, let's move on. In just a moment, I want to talk to you about the state of probation service, because I know you've got particular interest in that, David. And we'll also want to talk about George Santos and the British versions of George Santos as well. We'll do that next, George. Let's turn our attention now to the probation service, which is something that, David, you wrote last week, is something that we probably don't talk about nearly enough. A damning report out today shows that probation service errors allowed a man, Jordan McSweeney, who had a history of violence, to stay free and go on to murder Zara Alina in London in June. He was considered a medium, not high risk, meaning that when he breached his licence, his return to prison wasn't treated urgently enough. That report out today. And then, David, you covered another awful case in your column in the Times last week involving Damien Bendel.
Yeah, Damien Bendel was the guy who killed 4 people with a claw hammer. His girlfriend, her son, her daughter, and her daughter's friend who was on a sleepover. And this next case is kind of terribly similar, because it's about a risk assessment that goes wrong, and when you look into it, you look at the various reports of the probation service inspector, who's an independent, doesn't work for the probation service, is set up to inspect it independently. Essentially, what it is over the last couple of years is a series of warnings about how bad things are getting in parts of the country. For example, I mentioned in the piece last week, the inspectorate reported this November that large swathes of the probation service in London were shockingly bad. Well, it was the probation service in London that was dealing with the McSweeney, with McSweeney. Across the capital in November, there were 500 vacant positions among probation staff, a high number of staff off sick. This, of course, is the service that was briefly semi-privatized by Chris Grayling for 5 years, and then when some of the major companies involved went into administration in 2019, had to be brought back inside. But what it is a classic example of what I would call a Cinderella service, which is a service that most people don't want to talk about, and most of us don't encounter very often, which is suffering all the kind of chronic problems of long-term underfunding, quite possibly poor management as well, as you've seen this kind of the way in which it's been restructured, etc. And then what you get is difficulties in recruitment, low staff morale, high staff sickness, and so on. And it all gets worse and worse and worse and worse. And you feel after a while that at some point or other, with services like this, like drug rehabilitation services as well, somebody's got to step in and say, yeah, we know people don't like to think about these services a lot, but they do matter, and we need to try and bring them to the forefront of public consideration when we talk about how we fund and how we organise services.
And your point about it being a Cinderella service, David, which we don't talk about, you're so right that, clearly we've talked an awful lot in recent weeks about nurses, about train drivers, junior doctors, whatever it might be. These people, probation officers are, it varies, but it seems to be around £30,000 you get as a probation officer, making extraordinary judgments every day, trying to almost see into the minds of people that they don't particularly know and spend a huge amount of time with. Are you on the path to going straight, if you like, or do you still pose a threat? And every day they're having to make those narrow judgments. Yeah. And when it goes wrong, you get these terrible cases.
Very briefly, in the case of Bendel, for example, the conclusion of the review was that had a more experienced officer been handling Bendel's case, then probably a different assessment would have been made. So that gives you an example. That was in the review.
Danny, probation is just something no political, apart from when Chris Grayling privatised it, then unprivatised it. I can't remember the last time we had a political conversation about it.
Yeah, no, I thought David's column was excellent on this. It really is, an important area that the administration of justice we don't talk about enough. And one of the reasons I'm a bit resistant to pay strikes in other services is if we pay for those, we can't pay for this. There are choices to be made, and I always, when in Times editorial conference, we have this discussion because the Times is in general in favour of keeping control of public spending. And I'm always very hot when we then propose spending more money on something. But we all have something that we think would benefit, seriously from increased expenditure. In my case, it's the administration of justice in all forms, the court system. I was actually much more sympathetic to the criminal bar strike than I am to the latest round of private strikes, not of public sector strikes, not because I'm not sympathetic to anybody who's working very hard and isn't paid very much, but just because I thought that there we were seriously in danger of the system collapsing because we weren't paying people enough to get anybody.
Well, we'll see if this makes any difference. I suppose that the Jubilee is, in the most cynical way, there's no votes in saying going to pour more money into probation services.
Well, I don't know. Each individual item in any budget doesn't, win or lose elections. But I think these kind of very emotive cases, which are pretty much straightforwardly down to these kind of some of these funding issues, they are pretty directly electorally potent.
But let's finally move on with a end on a slightly lighter note. George Santos, who when I was in New York over Christmas, I delighted in reading almost every day another George Santos story. So this is a Republican elected in New York to Congress to represent New York, and almost everything he's ever said turns out not to be true. Claims about where he worked, where he grew up, his parents, his grandparents have turned out not to be true. Over the weekend, he finally admitted to being a drag queen at some point. David, you were quite taken by this story as well.
I'm very taken by this story, not least because I can't believe only America has Santoses, really. In public life, there are people who kind of appear. You quite often see them on the fringes of smaller parties and so on. They suddenly become candidates, I don't know, for the Brexit Party or something like that. And they say they're one thing, and they turn out to be a completely different thing. But they don't matter because they don't usually get into mainstream parties, because mainstream parties have some kind of vetting system. And I suddenly wondered whether during the course of, because Danny's been closer to the political coalface than I have. And I was wondering whether or not Jeffrey Archer was always regarded as being a character a bit like this.
I haven't quite come across this, but I have come across. Well, once I was asked by Watford Conservative Party whether I would be, I would sort of be on the hustings. I would interview the various candidates. So there was a time when they got sort of centre-right journalists and all that to interview their candidates for selection meetings, and I did this. And they chose the candidate, and at the end of it, I thought, that guy is fine, but he's very boring that they chose, compared to the other people who were a little bit less experienced, but much more interesting. And I was a bit disappointed they chose the most boring person anyway. But over the next year, it turned out that various things happened in Watford. The editor of the local newspaper had white paints dropped all over his car. The Liberal candidate had got massive daubed all over her door, some expletives and things like that. And when the police started to look into it, they found that the person guilty of it was the Conservative candidate that they selected, who I thought was incredibly boring. Shows how much I knew. So that was the closest I've come personally to. But you do occasionally come across people in politics whom you think to yourself, well, you are a fantasist, yes.
The George Santos list is amazing. He claimed to have worked at Goldman Sachs, and he hasn't, to have degrees from 2 New York colleges, which appear not to be true. He's accused of faking his grandparents' Jewish ancestry, claiming they escaped from the Holocaust. So also not to be true. I think probably the closest that I can think of is Paul Nuttall, with a guy who became UKIP leader. And people started, again, because, up until that point, it didn't make any difference. And he'd got some things on his LinkedIn that he'd got a PhD and he hadn't. He'd played football for Tranmere Rovers and he hadn't. He claimed that he'd been at Hillsborough and he hadn't. And when asked, he was pressed on this. I mean, I think it was Sophie Reed on Sky News pressed him all these things. In particular, why did you make up such a terrible thing that you'd been at Hillsborough and you hadn't? Because he was from Liverpool. And he said that it was all blown out of proportion. He said, it's not like I've been caught in a paedophile gang or anything. And I always thought the word "caught." I've just been doing a lot of work there.
Yeah, I've just been embellishing my CV. I mean, Jeffrey Archer did used to. I think he once, when applying for a job as a PE teacher, said he had an honours diploma from Berkeley. When he did it, turned out to be a correspondence course, and that is a kind of quite a horribly common form of embellishment, i.e. a lie.
He also used to say he went to Wellington, didn't he?
Yeah, well, something about Santos, which is really weird, as somebody said in one of the American programs, when he said that he played volleyball at a high level and injured both his knees playing for Baruch College, which he never went to, the person said, "Look, if you're going to lie about this, why volleyball? If you're going to embellish yourself, why did you choose volleyball?" I mean, I had no idea that knees were a problem in volleyball. But almost certainly he didn't have operations on it. In other words, absolutely nothing he says is true.
Amazing, isn't it?
Your daddy was coming. As Daddy came in this morning, he was saying his knees were hurting because he was playing volleyball last night. So there is definitely something in that.